Some crimes are so heartbreaking or shocking that they change laws, change society, or even earn the label crime of the century. But the stories that made headlines in decades past aren't necessarily remembered today. I'm Amber Hunt, a journalist and author, and in each episode of this show, I'll examine a case that's maybe lesser known today, but was huge when it happened. This is Crimes of the Centuries. The front page of the Cincinnati Enquirer on November 30th, 1904 was dominated by a single sensational story. Cassie Chadwick, a con woman whose swindling managed to shutter an entire bank in Oberlin, Ohio, was believed to have died by suicide. Then, as now, newspapers didn't tend to glorify suicide deaths, so front page placement was unusual. And it turned out inappropriate, because it wasn't true. But more on that in a bit. Now, Chadwick's crimes weren't actually in the Queen City. In fact, most were close to her adopted home in Cleveland, some 250 miles away. But her tale was so crazy that it had mesmerized not just all of Ohio, but the entire country and beyond. On the surface, Chadwick was an unlikely celebrity. She was plain-looking and matronly, with a slight lisp. She did have impeccable taste, however, as evidenced by her vast collection of fancy designer dresses, elaborate jewelry, and house full of tasteful art. Her friends in Cleveland knew her as an old-money Richie Rich who had inherited money from one dead husband before remarrying a local doctor. But Chadwick had chosen a select few with whom she opted to share a tantalizing secret. She was no mere wealthy widow, she assured these people, most of whom were the top tier of the upper crust, including some high-ranking bankers with access to serious cash. In truth, she told them, before swearing them to secrecy, she was an heiress. See, her father was one of the richest and most famous men in the world. Over the rags-to-riches tale that was his life, he'd become known as the Steel King, and now that he was in his sunset years, he was securing his legacy as a philanthropist by donating millions of his fortune to libraries and other fine causes. Later in life, in fact, he would create a foundation that has, quote, since supported everything from the discovery of insulin and the dismantling of nuclear weapons to the creation of Pell Grants and Sesame Street, end quote. That's straight from his nonprofit organization's website. But just as his website today makes no mention of the name Cassie Chadwick, nor did his biographies at the turn of the 20th century. Well, that could be explained, Chadwick said. See, she was Andrew Carnegie's illegitimate daughter, a child born out of wedlock, one that Mr. Carnegie was determined to keep a secret. So it was no use calling up Mr. Carnegie or his people and confirming her tales, see, because they would naturally deny it. But never fear, Cassie promised them in her lilting and lisping voice, I have proof. In hindsight, the proof she proffered maybe should have raised some eyebrows, but the people she told stood to financially benefit if the lie were true, and so they believed it. And because they did, Cassie Chadwick went down in history as one of the most successful grifters of the Gilded Age. Crimes of the Centuries is sponsored by 3 Day Blinds. I love my house, but I have to say it came with some seriously low-quality blinds that seem to snap in two if I just look at them wrong, so I've been meaning to upgrade for literally years. It just seems like such a hassle to go to a store with the measurements, set up the appointments, blah, blah, blah. Who has time for all that? 3-Day Blinds promises a better way to buy blinds and window treatments. They're the leading manufacturer of custom window treatments in the U.S., and right now they're running a buy one, get one 50% off deal. Nowadays, we can shop for nearly everything at home, so why not blinds? 3-Day Blinds has local, professionally trained design consultants with an average of 10+ years of experience. The expert team at 3-Day Blinds handles all the heavy lifting. They design, measure, and install, so you can sit back, relax, and leave it to the pros. Right now, you can get 3-Day Blinds buy one, get one 50% off deal on custom blinds, shades, shutters, and drapes. For a free, no charge, no obligation consultation, just head to 3dayblinds.com/COTC. That's buy one, get one 50% off when you head to 3dayblinds.com/COTC. One last time, that's the number 3, DAY blinds.com/COTC. To help tell the story of Cassie Chadwick, I'm getting assistance from this wonderful woman.
I'm Annie Reed, and I wrote The Impostor, Heiress, Cassie Chadwick, the greatest grifter of the Gilded Age.
The book, released by Diversion Books this June, is one of those good nonfiction reads that feels like fiction but is based on truth. I always love those. Cassie Chadwick caught Annie's eye because Cassie's a legend in Cleveland, and Annie, a historian, briefly lived in Cleveland as she and her husband were moving around the country to find their forever home. Cassie Chadwick wasn't a native Clevelander either. In fact, she wasn't even a native Cassie, nor a Chadwick. She was born Elizabeth Bigley in Eastwood, Ontario, a small Canadian town of about 150 people. She was the third oldest of 8 children, coming after sisters Alice and Annie, and before siblings Daniel, William, Mary Jane, Emily, and Retta. Elizabeth was a peculiar kid in that she was obsessed with wealth from an early age.
She kind of stuck out as a girl. She had this obsession with luxury and gowns and diamonds, and obviously in a small farming town, it just didn't blend in.
Or as Reed wrote, quote, "Other girls like pretty dresses, but Cassie was obsessed. Other girls oohed and awed over the jewels that came into their orbit, but Cassie fixated on them. Classmates whispered about the trances she fell into. What did she think about in those minutes she spent staring off into the distance? How could a person spend so long just thinking? Could she be demented?" Eastwood simply didn't understand Cassie, end quote. You'll notice Reed refers to Cassie as Cassie, even though at this young age she was actually Elizabeth. I'll do that too. Truth is, Cassie changed names more often than I changed hairstyles in my 20s, so it's easier to tell her story if you largely stick to one moniker. Speaking of hairstyles, when Cassie was 21, she went to a barbershop to get her hair cut. This was the 1890s, and asking for a very short cut on a young woman was kind of unheard of. But she was adamant. She wanted her hair cut short like a boy's. Not only that, but she wanted remnants of her lopped hair to be fashioned into a mustache. After her masculine makeover, she strutted into a pawn shop with a heavy gold watch she wanted to trade for cash. How the shopkeep saw through her disguise isn't clear. Maybe the barber had spread word about the young lady he'd just fashioned as a young man. But whatever the reason, the cops were called, and so was Cassie's father, who took her back home. After her hair had started to grow back in, she came up with another scheme. She waltzed into a dry goods store, a sort of general store back in the day that would have been a small town's version of a one-stop shop. Normally she wasn't able to afford much at one time, but this time she acted as though money were no object. When she took her selections to the clerk, she explained nonchalantly that she didn't have cash on her, but she did have a card. Not a credit card, of course. Those wouldn't come into existence until the 1950s. But the concept of credit itself had long been a thing. People borrowed money on their good names and reputations. In this instance, the store clerk didn't know anything about this customer with $250 worth of goods to buy, so he eyed the card she produced curiously. Printed on it were the words, "Miss Bigley, heiress to $18,000. She explained that a relative had died and left her a substantial inheritance, but the money was still tied up in probate court. Lawyers were dragging their feet, don't you know? Instead of paying for her goods with cash, Cassie handed the proprietor a promissory note, a slip of paper from a farmer from nearby Brantford that was essentially an IOU from the farmer to Cassie, who offered to sign it over to the storekeep to cash. And the dum-dum bought it. Not only that, but others bought it too.
And she got a lot of money that way. She was getting, $50, $100, $200, stuff like that. She ran that one for a little while, but eventually she had too many debts and she couldn't get more money to pay her debts, and so she was arrested.
It was, in a sense, a Ponzi scheme, but she wasn't pretending to invest anyone's money. Rather, she would borrow money using a forged promissory note, then pay back some of her lenders with other promissory notes. You all remember the Ponzi episode a few months back, right? Well, Annie Reed did.
I listened to your Ponzi podcast, the Peter paying Paul kind of situation, to where if you get in early, then you're probably going to get paid back. But then the later you get in, the less likely you are to get your money back.
Granted, Cassie couldn't have used Ponzi's fall from grace as a life lesson because she came 20 years before he did. And besides, people prone to conning others out of money don't seem to learn these types of lessons anyway. Now, the problem wasn't just that Cassie had stiffed some farmers out of money, though that was bad enough, but promissory notes at the time were exchanged as though they were legit money. It worked fine when everyone kept up their end of the bargain, but not only did Cassie not have money coming in to pay back the loans she took, she also straight up forged some of the notes she'd swapped, and those forged notes were used by the farmers who'd unwittingly accepted them to borrow money from other people and even banks. When those loans would come due, everything would collapse. Cassie came undone by an organ. This is the part of these stories that always galls me. She conned people for money and used that money to buy something she did not need, a musical instrument. And maybe I'd be more sympathetic if Cassie had been some kind of virtuosic player, but she wasn't. She just wanted an organ. She went to the Thomas organ factory, picked one out, and paid with a loan from a bank. Mr. Thomas was an understanding fellow, so he gave her some leeway when she said, "Geez, my inheritance is taking longer than I expected." But when Mr. Thomas's patience ran out, Cassie was arrested. The trial began in late 1879. It wasn't hard for prosecutors to prove the obvious, that Elizabeth Bigley, who claimed to be heiress Lizzie Bigley, wasn't an heiress at all and had scammed a few $1,000s off innocent fools. But Cassie's lawyer had a plan.
She pled insanity, not responsible for my actions because I was insane at this time. And that actually worked. She was acquitted on the basis of insanity.
It's hard to imagine how that stuck, considering it was a fairly elaborate scheme, the kind that's intricate enough that you'd think it'd be tough for an insane person to pull off. But people had a really hard time believing that this barely woman from Eastwood had outsmarted so many established men.
It's a little bit silly, but it worked.
So Cassie went back home to the Bigley house, but she of course didn't stay long. Her reputation was sullied in Eastwood, of course, where she was considered a liar, a forger, and an insane person to boot. There was no way to become rich, and rich was her destiny. Crimes of the Centuries is sponsored by Greenlight. The day I'm recording this is literally the first day of my preteen's new school year, and it's wild. I have a middle schooler on my hands who's going to be learning so much this year, and I don't just mean at school. It's time you learn some important life skills and continue building independence, and that's where Greenlight can help. Greenlight is a debit card and money app made for families. Parents can send money to their kids and keep an eye on kids' spending and saving, while kids and teens build money confidence and lifelong financial literacy skills. With a Greenlight app, kids learn how to save, invest, and spend wisely thanks to games that teach money skills in a fun, accessible way. The Greenlight app includes a chores feature where you can set up one-time or recurring chores customized to your family's needs and reward kids with allowances for a job well done. I really could have used this as a kid. I learned a lot of lessons the hard way when it came to money as an adult. My kiddo, on the other hand, has had his Greenlight account for several months and he's watching it grow. Millions of parents and kids are learning about money on Greenlight. It's the easy, convenient way for parents to raise financially smart kids and families to navigate life together. Sign up for Greenlight today and get your first month free when you go to greenlight.com/COTC. That's greenlight.com/COTC to try Greenlight for free. Greenlight.com/COTC. Cassie Chadwick was eager to leave behind her ruined reputation and impose herself on Sister Alice and Alice's new husband, who'd moved to Cleveland, Ohio after marrying in 1880. At the time, Cleveland was bustling. The population had doubled the decade before Cassie's arrival and was set to double again by the 1910s. The area's biggest industries were steel and ironworks, fields that made its leaders very, very rich. Annie Reed reported in the Impostor Heiress that 53 of the top 68 wealthiest people in America in 1892 were Clevelanders. Mansions lined Euclid Avenue in particular, making that an aspirational street for Cassie. Alice lived on Superior Street with her husband, Standish York, a mason. They lived in a nice enough home with furniture that would have awed most Eastwood residents, but in Cleveland, they ranked middle of the pack at best. Still, Cassie immediately exploited their standing and their hospitality. Soon after moving in, she started inviting moneylenders to visit her when Alice and Standish were away. She would introduce herself as Mrs. York, the lady of the house, and put up furniture as collateral for loans. A lender would choose a piece and then, because he was a conscientious banker, would check with neighbors to make sure he was dealing with an upstanding borrower. "Why, yes," the neighbor said. "Mrs. York is certainly dependable." Cassie Chadwick, however, was not. Soon, Alice and Standish were flummoxed when bankers stopped by their home to repossess their furniture. Standish kicked his sister-in-law out. The couple assumed Cassie would head back to Eastwood, but they were too irate to even check on her. Thus, they had no idea that she stayed in their city and took on an alias. She was now Mrs. Scott, staying in a boarding house belonging to a Mrs. Madison on Michigan Street. She began pulling out loans using her landlady's furniture as collateral, but at least this time she also worked for some money too. She adopted a second alias, this one Madame LaRose, a clairvoyant who would tell people their futures in exchange for a little cash. It was as yet another alias, Miss Lydia Bigley, that she met Dr. Wallace Springsteen, a celebrated Civil War veteran who had first enlisted in 1861 and engaged in 9 battles in just 13 months. He was so badly injured in the last of those battles that he was discharged, and yet he re-enlisted in 1864, engaged in 6 more battles, and was injured and discharged again. In short, he was a tough fellow. Springsteen was immediately smitten with Cassie, whom he found to be a charming, intelligent woman. He began courting her. He had no idea about her money troubles and didn't find it suspicious at all when his Lily, as he called her, wanted to get married as soon as he popped the question. They exchanged vows November 21st, 1882. Soon after that, Alice York came to the doctor's office. Since he had married her sister, she figured he could pay off the creditors who kept pestering her and Standish. Springsteen was blindsided, of course, and set about figuring out what else his new bride had kept from him. Soon, with the help of private detectives, he knew not only about her criminal past, but her previous insanity verdict. In early 1883, he pulled out a notice in the Cleveland Leader that read, quote, "I hereby forbid any person from trusting or harboring my wife, as I will pay no bills of her contracting after this date. Wallace Springsteen." End quote. That ran in March 1883. In November, another notice ran in the Cleveland Leader, this time announcing that Mrs. Lydia Springsteen was granted a divorce after alleging her husband, quote, "drove her away from their home last December," end quote. That meant they had lived as husband and wife for less than a month before he booted her out. Cassie retreated briefly back to Eastwood, then traveled to Erie, Pennsylvania, where she became Maisie Bagley, a rich but sick woman who desperately needed an oral operation. She would pick at her gums to make sure that they bled so people could see just how sick she was. As with her other fake rich personas, her money was tied up elsewhere, or else it would be oh so easy for her to pay for the operation she needed. She convinced enough people with the story that she fled Erie with tons of cash. Those who tracked her down to ask for their money back learned that, sadly, Maisie hadn't survived her illness. Soon, Cassie really was in need of medical attention because she was pregnant. She gave birth to a boy she called Emil Hoover. He got his surname from the proprietress of another boarding house in Cleveland where Cassie had briefly circled back. Her next stop was Toledo, where Cassie used that boarding house surname again and became Lydia Hoover. She also dusted off her crystal ball to become Madame Lydia de Vere, clairvoyant. She actually became pretty successful at this because she was good at reading people. She figured out how to size folks up, men especially, and tell them what they wanted to hear. She would host fancy parties where she would drop fictitious snippets of her past that usually involved earls or dukes or other such fancy titles.
When she was in Toledo, she had a whole backstory about how she had married this English officer and gone overseas to his family, but they didn't approve of her. So when he died, they paid her to leave and never return.
Her second husband, Dr. Samuel Hoover, had only married her for her money, she said, and then he'd had an affair. Now the scoundrel was in prison for performing an abortion. Women didn't have many rights at the time, so even though he was in prison, Dr. Hoover was in total control of Lydia Hoover's money. How awful was that?
And then she also, after that, she was telling people that her sister had married this man named Richard Brown, and he was a real person. He lived in Youngstown, Ohio. He was this iron magnate. Her sister had never met Richard Brown. She didn't know Richard Brown, but she made up this whole story that her sister had married him and had this child, but her sister died, and so Cassie was taking care of the child. Richard Brown had all Cassie's money for some reason. It was never quite clear why her brother-in-law had her money, but he did, and he wasn't going to let her have any of it, but she was taking care of his son, and he was this horrible person.
Joe Lamb believed Cassie's story, and more than that, he believed in her gift. He spotted her money as she needed it. Soon, she upgraded her living quarters. Next, she bought a carriage and horses. Then she upped the ante further and not only had several servants working for her, but she was routinely spotted wearing new jewels. Joe Lamb never questioned that she would be able to pay him back when he needed it because she was clearly rich. Just look at how she lived. But then she got sick, supposedly. She told Joe she was losing money rapidly paying for treatments. She talked him into forging a promissory note in Richard Brown's name. It wasn't hard, considering Joe had been hearing about this awful Richard Brown for months on end. So he did, and that worked. And then Cassie had Joe do it in another man's name, and another. Finally, those early notes in Richard Brown's name got back to Richard Brown. He was not pleased. He denied having married Cassie's sisters, having fathered her children, having controlled Cassie's money. In early 1890, Cassie and Joe were arrested. Joe finally realized he'd been duped and turned against her. Cassie was convicted and sentenced to 9.5 years in the state pen. While Cassie was in prison, her family took care of Emile. She was assigned the prison job of seamstress, sewing shirts. She did as she was told and kept her head down, helping to earn her parole just a few years into her sentence. With Emile in tow, she returned to Cleveland in 1895. There, she met another doctor. Dr. Leroy Chadwick was a widowed father to a daughter named Mary. He'd grown up wealthy in a home on Cleveland's Millionaire Row, and what struck him immediately about Cassie Hoover, as he knew her, was her familiarly cavalier attitude toward money. She maneuvered her way around the stuff only as a born rich person could. This told him that she came from the right breeding. She also was the right temperament. And she gave him massages, which, as a 40-something with arthritis, he really appreciated. So he married her. As they settled into what seemed like comfortable domestic bliss, Mr. Chadwick had no way of knowing just how much of an impact his new wife would have on all of Cleveland. Before I continue with the tale of Cassie Chadwick, a quick aside that I promise has a point. My partner Scott likes to point out just how foolish some scams are when you see them in movies. Take the 1945 film Gaslight, he says. I'd warn you about spoilers, but if you haven't seen it after nearly 80 years, that's on you. Anyway, the gist of the plot is that there's this opera singer, Paula, whose opera singer aunt was murdered, and it was awful and it went unsolved. Time goes on, though, and Paula marries her accompanist, Gregory, who, after a whirlwind romance, starts to make her feel insane. He convinces her she's flighty and on edge and forgetful, and she notices that the gas lights dim when he isn't home, but he tells her she's nuts and just seeing things, and this is why today we call making someone else feel crazy gaslighting. It turns out that Gregory was actually the murderer of Paula's aunt Alice, and the whole romance was a long con so he could rummage through Paula's stuff looking for jewels he knew Alice had but were never found after her murder. To this, Scott says,
It's like, but you're already married to her. Like, what's the point? Why even go that extra step? You've won. Let it go.
Now, I bring this up because that's what I think of at this point in Cassie Chadwick's story. In 1897, Cassie married Dr. Leroy Chadwick, who was well off. He made good money. He already had the type of home that Cassie, back in her days as little Elizabeth Bigley, had dreamed of. She could have stopped here, but she didn't. No matter how much Cassie had, she wanted more. It wasn't enough to live comfortably or even affluently. She had to live ostentatiously to flaunt her wealth to an absurd degree.
She's also buying cars for people as like wedding presents. She spreads it around. She's donating money sometimes, but a lot of this like expensive wedding presents, she's trying to buy her way into society. Because she marries Leroy Chadwick and he's from a society family, and she's trying to fit in and like increase her place in society. And so if you buy people a car for their kid's wedding, then that's going to help you out.
Plus, she had accrued earlier debts, so some of this new-to-her money was getting her out of earlier scrapes. And she didn't want to broadcast that debt to her new husband, who had been led to believe that she was a woman of means to begin with. That's what led Cassie to the Citizens National Bank in Oberlin, Ohio. This isn't to be confused with the still thriving Citizens National Bank in Bluffton, Ohio, which didn't open until 1920. Anyway, the Oberlin Bank's president was a man named Charles Beckwith, and its cashier was a guy named Arthur Spear. Cassie at first asked for a simple loan, which she got, no big deal. Then she asked for more and more. And what's kind of ironic is that one of the main reasons these two men, these banking experts, believed Cassie was indeed as wealthy as she claimed to be was because she acted like she was a financial idiot. And the men took that idiocy to mean, well, here's a lady who's never had to worry about money in her life. She surely has always had a man do her finances. Only a rich woman would behave like that. Cassie dusted off her old Heiress routine and injected it with some major steroids. This time, she explained she wasn't simply some woman whose relative left her a small fortune, but rather, she was Andrew Carnegie's illegitimate daughter, a love child he would like to be kept secret, thank you very much.
The main crux of what she'd do is go to banks, bankers, businessmen, and say, I'm Carnegie's daughter. I get this trust twice a year to where I get $175,000 twice a year. And I need some money until that comes in. So I'm a sure bet you're not going to lose your money if you loan me $50,000, $100,000, something like that, because Carnegie's daughter is not going to default on any loans.
To bolster this claim, she did something quite clever. She told a lawyer, whom she expected to have loose lips, that she needed him to accompany her to Carnegie's house in New York. Her father had to sign a very important document for her, she said.
So he goes with her to New York, and they stay in her favorite fancy hotel, the Holland House. They get in a carriage and go to Carnegie's actual house, his big mansion, and he is going to go in and get the signature. And at the last minute, she says, well, Carnegie, this is really a personal thing. We don't need you there, so I'll go in myself. You stay out here. And she goes into the Carnegie house for 20 minutes, half an hour, comes back with his signature.
It wasn't, of course, Carnegie's real signature, and the banker was annoyed he didn't get to meet the world's richest man himself, but he was nevertheless convinced that the document Cassie had was the real deal. It promised Cassie $7 million at a future date. Cassie told the lawyer,
don't tell anyone, though. And obviously he tells a lot of people. It was part of this ploy to get this story circulating that she was in the Carnegie house, so she must really be Andrew Carnegie's daughter, which is what she's trying to sell at that point.
Word spread to the Oberlin bankers, who ended up loaning Cassie nearly $250,000 in a mixture of bank funds and their own personal money. By the way, $250,000 in 1904 money is nearly $9 million today. Cassie did her usual shtick, where she managed to pay back a few people by borrowing from others, which bought her some time. But eventually, as is the case with the Ponzi scheme, she ran out of people to tap.
She couldn't pay people. It repeats itself, and she's always so sure that she's figured out how to keep people from suing her. She gets a lot of mileage out of nobody wants to embarrass Andrew Carnegie. She impresses on everybody. Andrew Carnegie doesn't want a scandal. He loves me because he's my dad and he's so generous, but he does not want a public scandal. So you should never tell anyone. And obviously suing her in court, who's going to sue Andrew Carnegie's daughter?
It wasn't until she crossed a man named Herbert Newton that the walls came closing in. Newton wasn't a Cleveland man. He was from Brookline, Massachusetts, but he was introduced to Cassie through his connections there. He did his due diligence, too, after hearing her Carnegie claims. He asked multiple high-profile lawyer and banker types who attested that, yeah, Cassie was the real deal. So he loaned her $190,000, on which she was set to pay interest that made it worth his while. When she didn't pay him back on time, he started getting suspicious. What's funny is that he faced a lot of pushback from the others who had loaned her money. The Oberlin Bank fellas, for example, were exceedingly patient with her for two reasons. First, Cassie had promised that their bank would manage her $7 million once she had control of it, and that would be a boon not just for the bankers, but for the entire town of Oberlin and everyone who invested in Citizens National Bank. And second, they were victims of my old nemesis, the sunken cost fallacy. They were in too deep, so they wouldn't let them see what was becoming increasingly obvious. They had been had, and by a woman, no less. Newton swallowed his pride much earlier. By the fall of 1904, he sued Cassie, which had a domino effect on all the other loans she'd pulled out. Newton told reporters that he couldn't fathom how she had bamboozled so many people, but she had. He knew it. This is when Cassie's name became a non-stop feature in newspapers nationwide. On November 30th, 1904, the Enquirer pieced together that Cassie had previously worked as the clairvoyant Madame de Vere, and someone in Anderson, Indiana claimed that de Vere had died by self-ingesting poison the week prior. By the time the story ran, Cassie was supposedly already buried in an unmarked grave in Alexandria. The headline read, "Rumors of Mrs. Chadwick's suicide followed the death of Madame de Vere. Strange complications in Oberlin." But it seems even the newspaper realized at the time that the rumors were false, because in another story on the same front page, they posited the question, "Where is Mrs. Chadwick?" It's like they knew she wasn't dead, but they couldn't resist the sales boost. The very next day, they attempted to answer the whereabouts question with a front-page story that began, "Late tonight, it was reported that Mrs. Cassie L. Chadwick had suddenly left New York and gone to Pittsburgh." The tale of suicide, by the way, was never mentioned again. Cassie was indicted by year's end. So too were her husband and the Oberlin bankers, Arthur Spear and Charles Beckwith. They were charged because they had violated their own bank rules by loaning Cassie money without the appropriate collateral, and they tried to cover it up by putting their own money into the bank. The case predated the creation of the Federal Deposit Insurance Corp., which was formed as part of the Banking Act of 1933 after the market collapse that launched the Great Depression. Before the FDIC, people who deposited their money with a bank had to trust the bank to do right by them. In a surprising gesture of magnanimity, Andrew Carnegie, of all people, actually bailed out the people of Oberlin with his own money. Even though it wasn't his fault that somebody had used his name to destroy the bank, he didn't want to be associated with an entire town's downfall. He never testified against Cassie, however.
Andrew Carnegie really did not want to deal with Cassie Chadwick. He wanted to be as far away from this whole situation as possible.
It was beneath him, see? He knew what kinds of headlines would be generated by him on the stand being asked about his youthful dalliances. He was toward the end of his life and wanted the focus to be on his philanthropy and his legacy, not whether it was feasible he'd impregnated some woman in his 20s.
He refused to testify in the grand jury proceeding even. He just wrote an affidavit that was like, "I didn't sign these notes. I don't know Cassie Chadwick. I haven't signed a note in years." And then he got a doctor to diagnose him with back pain and left for Florida. And he was basically like, "Just try and make me come and testify in front of the grand jury."
Beckwith didn't live long enough to stand trial. The stress of the ordeal seemed to compound an illness he was already battling. He died in his home in early February 1905. Leroy Chadwick was cleared. There had never been any evidence proving he had known what his wife was up to. With two of the originally indicted people out of the picture, those first indictments disappeared, replaced instead by new ones in April 1905. Arthur Spear, the Oberlin bank clerk, was indicted for making false entries into the bank books. And Cassie, who was still insisting she was good for all the dough she had stolen, was indicted for aiding and abetting Spear. They both were convicted. Cassie was ordered to serve 10 years in prison. She died after serving only 2 in 1907 while still in prison of a strange condition.
It says neurasthenia on her death record. And that was kind of this strange, not real diagnosis back then.
The phrase isn't used anymore, but once upon a time, it was sort of a catch-all diagnosis for rich people who had lost all their energy and vitality, and doctors couldn't explain why. Most likely, she died of heart failure. Spear was still in prison when she died. He would go on to serve all but 4 months of his sentence, until President Howard Taft granted him a pardon. Taft decided in 1910 that Speer had only been acting under the orders of his boss Beckwith and had suffered enough. Turned out that wasn't true. In November 1910, just 8 months after he was freed, Speer died in a Detroit hospital from peritonitis, resulting from typhoid fever that he had contracted after his prison release as he was working as a traveling auditor for the Bell Telephone Company. One newspaper labeled him a victim of the quote-unquote Cassie Chadwick financial bubble burst of 1904. To research this story, I read the Impostor Heiress, Cassie Chadwick, the Greatest Grifter of the Gilded Age by Annie Reed, and interviewed Annie for this podcast. Special thanks to her for enduring that. And if you'd like far more detail about this case than I presented here, please check out her book. I also read a bunch of contemporary news reports in newspapers nationwide, though I focused largely on the Cleveland Leader and the Cleveland Plain Dealer, which proved the most reliable overall. Crimes of the Centuries is available early and ad-free through Grab Bag Collab. Join us at patreon.com/grabbagcollab to hear not just exclusive content related to this show, but to also get access to several other shows on our profit-sharing network. Unless noted in the citations, this case was researched and written by me, Amber Hunt, and produced by Amanda Rossman and Henry Lavoie. Original music is by Bruce Hunt, Andrew Higley, and occasionally by my son, Hunt Van Ben Scoten. Other music comes from Soundstripe and Epidemic Sound. If you like